Good evening, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you today. Wonderful to see some old faces, familiar faces, particularly the Oxbridge Society. And of course, wonderful to see some and meet some new people as well. So as Advaita said, I'm a professor of marketing at the University of Cambridge. I've spent my career studying innovation. And in the first part of my career, roughly from the mid-90s to about 2007 or so, I studied innovation as it was done in large Western corporations. The understanding was that's where innovation happens. And I studied high-tech sectors like pharmaceuticals, biotech, banking, and so on. And then in about 2007, 2008, along with some of my co-authors, we noticed that some of these large Western corporations that we had been studying had begun to do something very interesting and different. They were setting up very large captive R&D centers in China and India. And this bucked the academic research on the topic, because the academic research had concluded that whatever you might offshore and outsource, so for instance, you might offshore your manufacturing to China, you might offshore your back office stuff to India, R&D was different. Innovation would stay close to headquarters in countries that had very robust intellectual property protection. But that had started to shift. So I got a year off, I got a fellowship to study this phenomenon, and I traveled extensively in China and India. And I went to these very large captive R&D centers to see what was happening there. And it was here in Bangalore at Cisco when I was talking to one of the people there, very much decorated scientist, with a lot of patents on his wall, an American actually, and I asked him, so what exactly are you guys doing in India? And he looked at me and he said, we are doing Jugaad. And I looked at him and I thought initially, is he pulling my leg? Is he serious? And I said, what do you mean you're doing Jugaad? Because in my mind, it wasn't something I would equate it with a large corporation, particularly a multinational. And he said, well, you look at a country like India, you have you made huge progress, but you have huge needs, unmet needs. You have a very large rural population who have healthcare needs, and all the doctors and the hospitals are in the cities. So in a situation like that, you've got to have some kind of telemedicine. That's what we're doing here at Cisco in India. But it's got to be highly affordable. And we figure that if we can do this in a way that's successful in India, we can take it to other emerging markets. And we could even take it to the Western world. We could take it to the UK, where you have an aging population, where the NHS cannot cope with people in the hospitals. And of course, if we could find a way to treat them in their homes, so much the better. So that's when I first began to, ironically as an Indian who grew up in this country and knew what Jugaad was intimately, I began to take this seriously. And along with my co-author, Nabi Raju, and actually our other co-author, Simon Ahuja, we began to study this phenomenon and innovation in India more generally over the next few years. And we would initially write about this on blogs like the harvardbusinessreview.org website. We wrote fairly often, and we looked at this phenomenon quite comprehensively. We began to write about this from the grassroots, from how it was happening in rural India by farmers or craftsmen and women in rural India, to Indian towns and cities where you saw startups using this approach, to, of course, even these large multinationals and large Indian companies. And then it was about 2011 or so when we got an email out of the blue from an agent who said, was an American, by the way, but she had spent 2 years in Random House here in India before going back to the US. She said, have you guys thought about writing a book on Jugaad? I think this is an idea that the world needs to know about. So we said, okay. And so with our help, we put together a proposal, and very soon that ended up as the book that was mentioned earlier by Advaita. So that book came out in 2012. It was all about how this kind of frugal innovation, affordable innovation, was happening in countries like India, but not only India. Most of the stories were from India, but we also looked at stories from other emerging economies in Asia, in Africa, Latin America. And the idea was, this is what the West Western companies that come to emerging markets can learn from their counterparts here. That book, when it came out in 2012, was well received, not only in India, it was received in the West as well. But in the West, we realized there was an interest in this phenomenon in the West for the West. So my co-author Navi and I, we went on to study what was happening in the West in this context, and we realized that there were some distinctions. In the West, this drive for frugal innovation seemed to be driven by a particular group of consumers that we called prosumers, because these people were not passive recipients of products and services from companies. They were much more actively involved in the socio-economic process, and they were driving three movements we felt contributed to a frugal economy. One was the sharing economy, where people like you and me could trade spare assets with each other on some digital platform, think Airbnb. The second was what we call the maker movement, where small teams, sometimes of our students in places like Cambridge, could do things that only large companies or the government could have done 10 or 20 years ago, and not just in software, but also in hardware. If you think about WhatsApp, that's an example, 4 guys doing it in 6 months. Or if you think of something like the Raspberry Pi, if you don't know what that is, it's a little computer microprocessor made by one of our colleagues in Cambridge from the computer science department, which sold for about $30. They now have a $5 version. That's become phenomenally successful. So that was the maker movement. And the third was the circular economy. This is where companies had realized, and society and prosumers had realized, that through the 20th century, we had a model that was very linear. Companies took resources from nature, made products and services with them that they sold to us, we used them and then dumped them back in nature. And that this was both unsustainable and also very wasteful. Companies had begun to move to a circular model of reducing, reusing, and recycling all the resources that go into products and services we produce and consume. So having looked at that, we then went on to write a second book, which we called Frugal Innovation, which was all about how large Western corporations, which we had sort of caricatured in the Jugaad book as being very structured, very expensive, very insular in their approach to innovation. That was their old model. We were surprised to find a lot of these large Western corporations were now also trying to do frugal innovation. And not only in places like India, in emerging markets, but also in the West for the West. And that was driven by many things, but largely by environmental and social pressures and concerns. So that book came out in 2015. And that was all about the Western corporation. But then as we continued to research this topic and visit India often, we realized India was moving on. And India was, in a way, catching up in some ways with the West. The maker movement was spreading in India. You had, a sharing economy. You had a circular economy picking up here. So in 2019, we wrote an updated version of the Frugal Innovation book that was more India-centric, and it had more examples from India, and was published only in India. So that was 2019. That brings us to today. I've stuck with researching this topic now for the last 15 to 20 years. And today, I think we are at another inflection point here in India. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and I think that's what we might end up talking a lot about. I think where we are today in India is that India has made tremendous progress over the last 2 to 3 decades. It's now the 5th largest economy. Soon it might be the 3rd largest economy in the world. And a lot of that is because India has managed to unleash its entrepreneurial ingenuity, a lot of which is this Jugaad mindset, this frugal mindset, of course done ideally to a good end. So we have done that. However, as Advaita said, we still have a long way to go. If you look at India's GDP per capita, if you look at its Human Development Index, we are in the 130s in the world. That's not a very impressive place to be. So we need to grow, we need to develop, but that has to be done in an inclusive way, and that has to be done in a frugal way, because we don't have a large amount of resources. India is still highly resource constrained. We have to choose a model of growth that is frugal and inclusive. And that's where the Jugaad mindset is important. But what we're seeing now, I want to argue, is that where India has been applying Jugaad and the Jugaad mindset using ubiquitous Western technology and adopted business models so far, now we're beginning to see much more indigenous innovation, often, in many cases, new to the world-beating stuff, sometimes high technology married to social impact. And I think that is going to be a game changer. We're seeing that in sector after sector after sector. You know, here in Bangalore, ISRO and space tech is an example. DPI, UPI, fintech is another sector. AI for India is yet another sector. So we could go on. Just on Monday, I was at an organization called Social Alpha. They're very excited about bridging the gap between science, technology, entrepreneurship, and social impact. And they were talking about lots of Indian startups that are in that space of applying high technology for social impact with unique intellectual property. So I think I want to stop there. My thesis being that we are at an inflection point in India. I think we need to be able to continue marrying this Jugaad mindset that many of us have, our native ingenuity, our ability to think frugal, our ability to think flexibly, and our ability to think about inclusion as well. We've got to marry that Jugaad mindset to technology, to products, to world-beating ideas that would not only transform India, but potentially transform other emerging markets like India and also potentially Western economies. So I'd like to stop there, and perhaps Mikan and I can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you so much, Jaideep, for agreeing to be part of this conversation and bringing this topic up. And I think as we were chatting, you talked about the social media comments that you received, which were quite polarizing with the use of the word Jugaad. So, like, this word is understood in many different ways. You've tried to give it a color, but people still have their own views on what this word means to them. Would you share some of the difficult or nasty comments that you received? Yeah. And how did you respond to them? Like, what were people upset about when you called something Jugaad? And how did you deal with it?
Okay, that's a wonderful question to get us started. I wonder if we could do a quick show of hands with your permission. Let's get a poll sense of our audience, okay? And I try not to bias this question because I could ask this question with that. Let me start by asking, how many of you think Jugaad is a bad idea? Just one person. Oh, I'm sure more people think. Come on.
3, 4, 5. It's okay. Please,
okay.
Go ahead.
Great.
6, 7.
Good, okay. Yeah, okay, exactly, okay. How many of you think it's a good idea? Okay, more seem to think, maybe that's why they've come for this event, because they are converts, right? They're How many think it's sort of, there's good things, there's bad things? Okay, yeah, I think I might put my hand up as well. Okay, so I think it gave us a sense. Now, as I was saying, we started blogging about Jugaad in 2009, 2010. This was on the hbr.org website. And one of the nice things about the website is that it has a very large audience, global audience. And they're not shy to comment. And like much social media, you know, they give you the unvarnished view. And what was very interesting is that we got some positives, you know, people saying from India saying, yeah, this is great that you're highlighting something that's so Indian, that every Indian does from the moment they're born and so on. Finally, somebody's talking about this. Even in the West, people were intrigued, like our agent, who's American, and in her 2 years in India was very impressed. She thought this was a distinctly Indian thing that the world should know about. So we got some positive stuff, but we also got some pretty vitriolic stuff, right? And both from Indians and from people in the West. And from Indians, we got comments to the effect that you guys should be ashamed of yourselves, celebrating something that's the worst aspect of India. This is what is holding India back. This is bad quality, all this kind of stuff, you know. So we got those kinds of comments from some Indians. And then we got comments negative comments from people in the West as well. people saying, you keep your third world problems to your countries. Don't bring those solutions here. We don't need those. Things like that. So that gave us pause for thought. But we thought, at least it's engaging people, and people are, excited. Well, it's arousing emotions. And then, of course, when the book came out, we did book tours and events in India. We went to all the metros. We went to even some smaller towns and so on. And invariably, people would ask us this question, about, is this something India should be celebrating? And it keeps happening. Every week there'll be an article where somebody says, it's time for India to move on. This is, okay, it may have been fine at one point, but, it's time we leave this behind, if we're going to make progress. So I think that view is still quite strongly held.
Got it. So I think you touched upon this piece about quality, right? That often for a lot of people, one of the core issues with the idea of Jugaad is that it's low quality. It embodies what some of us also call the chalta hai attitude. Hey, this small fix is solving the problem, so why go to the root cause? Why create a better solution or stop the quest early? When you experience this, and as you've researched this, do you see the small fixes or local solutions being, in some sense, an enemy of better or great that we could go? Or do you see them as a stepping stone to, hey, once you've tried this, you'll probably go further?
Again, I think that's a very nice way to think about it, is that you can get stuck in a rut where all you're doing is quick fixes, and you never get to anything beyond that. So it's a kind of a local solution which doesn't go beyond that particular case or application. But you can also think of it as a stepping stone to the next stage. And often I talk about this when I'm talking to people in large companies or even in startups. And the idea being that, if you think about the whole process of innovation, there is what I call a fuzzy front end, where you need to experiment and you'll fail a lot, and you don't want to do that in an expensive and time-consuming way. That famous phrase, you want to fail faster and cheaper and so on, and often. And in that phase, Jugaad is very helpful, because that's the mindset. You try out various things quickly, quick and dirty, and then you learn something. And then, of course, you might come up with a jewel of the sort of rough diamond, which you then have to perfect through perhaps other methods. So I think that's a very nice way to think about it. And same with startups. You might happen upon a minimum viable product. You do the Jugaad, lean startup, bootstrapping, all that kind of stuff. Right. But at some point you have to scale, and that may be when you might have to leave some of that Jugaad behind. Although even the scaling process could use some aspects of Jugaad.
That's awesome. So this piece about experimenting, trying, failing, finding something that works first, right? Before you try and solve much larger problems, that requiring this Jugaad mindset, you're willing to use whatever local resources, whatever you have to get that started. But then as you work towards taking that solution to production quality, to something that you can be proud of, where you read Made in India, it stands for something. Do you think, and in your experience, have you seen it hurt, this process of improving quality, of productionizing, of scaling? And are you seeing it as a dichotomy or like either or, that, hey, people who are okay with experimenting, failing, etc., are unable to make this shift, and vice versa?
Yeah. So Mukesh is a co-author and friend, and his son Nikhil is here. We've been co-teaching a class at Ashoka on Jugaad. And we've been interviewing a lot of large companies, but also startups. And we've been asking them this question of, is Jugaad helpful in the early stages? And many of them say absolutely. It's when we come to scaling that they are more circumspect, and that's when they start to they really have to think hard about what are the pros and cons. And I've also looked at this in large corporations that come at it from the other side. They have very structured approaches, and now they've had to learn Jugaad, and that's very hard for them. And so what I've concluded is that once you get to a certain scale, or if you're trying to get to scale, Jugaad and, of course, more formal approaches, processes, and so on, structures for innovation are different tools that you need in your toolkit. It's like one's a screwdriver and one's a hammer, let's say. You need both.
Yeah.
And you also need to know which is appropriate in what context and at what stage and so on, and for what application. And so that's how I think about it. And that's why I'm comfortable with the idea, absolutely, that you can have good uses of Jugaad, appropriate uses of Jugaad, but also bad and inappropriate uses of Jugaad, right? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna push you a little on that around. If you were to say, hey, what's a good role model of good Jugaad that has created probably large impact?
Yeah.
What comes to your mind?
Okay, so just the first thing that came to mind was not an Indian case story. It's a Kenyan story, which Indians would probably know, which is M-Pesa. Okay, and this came out in 2007 in Kenya, and it was introduced. So this mobile payments. Everybody, how many people have heard of M-Pesa? Yeah, it hasn't taken off in India, but it's phenomenally successful in Kenya, and it was first introduced in Kenya, and it's basically mobile payments. So somebody, let's say a lady from a village in Kenya, in 2007 when the service came out, could use her basic Nokia type phone, not smartphone, right, text-enabled phone, to call her son who might be working in Nairobi earning an income, not only to speak to him, but also to ask him to send money home in an emergency, which he could do by texting it to her. She would receive it on her phone as like a text message. And then she could go to the local Kirana shop, which was the M-Pesa agent, and cash it, right? So this was money transfer. And this was not introduced or done by a bank, but it was done by a mobile phone company, albeit one that was doing very well in Kenya. And the team in Vodafone subsidiary that came up with this idea, actually the software was developed in Cambridge, and they got some funding from DFID, which was the UK's development arm. So there was a bit of Jugaad there, corporate Jugaad, right, like putting resources together. And initially they thought of this idea because they had seen takeoff of mobile phones relative to bank accounts. And they thought, okay, maybe we can do financial transactions on the phone. And that was the initial idea for people who are outside the formal economy, in slums and so on. And they thought, okay, what if we gave this to microfinance agents? This will help them to recover the microfinance loans more easily. Then they went with this idea, preconceived. They went into Kibera, which is a slum in Nairobi, and they introduced it to the microfinance agents as in the trial phase, right? So this is the Jugaad phase of the process. And they realized very quickly that it wasn't going to work because the microfinance agents were not happy with having to be disintermediated by a technology. They wanted to go door to door. That's how they built trust and relationships. So these guys were a bit stuck. They had already come up with some idea, which often happens, and then they were hoping it would sell and wasn't. And then they were thinking desperately, what do we do? Do we kill this project? And then one of that team noticed that in the slum, people were already applying a Jugaad. Below the radar solution, they were exchanging mobile minutes with each other as a form of currency in the slum. And that's when they said, hey, what we're trying, we can just scale this, and the killer app would be money transfer from the city to the village, but also micropayments for people in the informal economy. And that's when they worked with the central bank. So this is where the Jugaad starts to become more formal. But even there with the central bank, and very interestingly, the central bank also went along with this. They could have been very formal and process-oriented, but they began to experiment with them. And in about 6 months, they gave them a letter of no objection. They were satisfied that this platform was robust and that it met some international money laundering regulations, and they let them introduce. And then, it was phenomenally successful, and then they took it to other countries in Africa. So to me, that's a very interesting example of where Jugaad was very helpful up to a point, and then you had to become more systematized, and you scale it.
Fascinating. And it's funny, the number of telecom operators that have tried to do this in India. India has become the mobile payment, I think, the largest amount of mobile payments happening across the world. And none of the telecom operators have been able to pull it off. Like Airtel Money Reliance Jio, everybody's tried to be M-Pesa in India, and it's been a different set of players who've been able to do this. Uh, yeah, I think you talked about the quality piece, and it's useful to think of Jugaad as a tool that's available to you to discover solutions, to find something that's working. Let's maybe how how do you feel people who do this well, and you just talked about the M-Pesa story of being able to observe and watch. Um, how could you learn this? How do you scale this?
Yes. How do you learn this? I should be asking you that question because you're the you got the curriculum. But since we're in Bangalore and not too far from here, let me talk about another example that's in the book. That's Selco, the solar electric lighting company, and Harish Hande. So Harish Hande's story. How many people have heard of Selco? Quite a few. Okay. Have you heard of Harish Hande? Okay, quite a few. So Harish is the founder and CEO. He grew up in India. He studied engineering at IIT Kharagpur. He's the same batch as Kejriwal, Arvind Kejriwal. And then he went to the US and he did a PhD in environmental engineering. And he was traveling in Central America, and he saw that a lot of people in Central America and rural Central America were using solar for lighting. So he decided to come back to India and set up Selco to sell solar electric lights to people who are outside the formal economy, who typically would use kerosene for lighting. And he went in again, very much like it often happens with educated, technical people. He had a solution looking for a problem, or he thought he understood the problem. And he says the first thing he realized was the affordability question, right? And that wasn't about the technology, it was about the affordability. And he says the best lesson in life he learned was from a fruit cart vendor, typical customer of his, who told him that 300 rupees a month for this solution was too much, but 10 rupees a day was not. And that was a puzzle to him. And this is somebody who grew up in India, but in the formal economy. And so the informal economy was a different world for him. So he had to learn a key lesson of any Jugaad or frugal innovator in India and places like that, which is you really have to understand the problem from the perspective of the people who are facing it, and only then come up with a solution. And so that's what he did. He spent time with people like this fruit cart vendor, and he realized that somebody like her would wake up in the morning. First thing she'd do is take a loan from the local money lender. She would then buy fruit and veg, which she would sell during the day. In the evening, she would repay the money lender with interest because it compounds daily. Then she would buy food for her family, and then if she had 10 rupees left over, she would buy kerosene. So with that insight, he then works backwards to come up with a solution. Technology is only a means to the end now. And how do you get how do you get solar lighting to someone like that for 10 rupees cash a day? Then he thinks up his solution, which is local people who he trains to maintain the batteries, panels, and lights. He worked with a bank to give them a loan, which he would guarantee for 6 months. With the loan, that person would set up a shop, buy the equipment, charge the batteries during the day, and then rent them to people like the fruit cart vendor for 10 rupees cash in the evening. So that's a kind of jugaad, which then scales in a much steadier way than most venture capitalists would like. But it's a quite ingenious solution that makes a difference to the life of the fruit cart vendor, but also to the local entrepreneur, because he's creating a community of and an ecosystem of local entrepreneurs. So I think you learn it if you're really dedicated to the problem you're trying to solve, then reality teaches you these lessons. Necessity becomes the mother of invention. And then if you're really committed to solving that problem, and I think that's the key, that you should have this passionate desire to solve that problem, come what may, not be wedded to the solution, but to wedded to the problem. And then persevere. I mean, it takes time. So a lot of these people persevere.
No, I'll just add a little bit from our own experience of working with young people who then go out into communities to try and find solutions to problems that they identify in the community. And I've been fascinated by what young people have picked as problems and chosen to solve. I'll give you 2 or 3 quick examples. 2 young girls, about 5 hours from Hyderabad, very rural government school, decided to build a snake detector. It's not a problem you and I will think of, but in rural Andhra Pradesh, hey, as in getting bitten by a snake could lead you to an early death. There are about 60,000 people who die annually in India thanks to snake bites. But these ninth standard girls decide that, hey, it should be possible to detect if there is a snake moving around and try and solve it. There's another 4 kids in Bhopal who just built a dog collar that's radium coated, so it shines in the night with the intention of preventing road accident or road kills, which to all of those who travel on Indian highways, we've seen it. I've seen it many, many times and done nothing about it. These kids decide that, hey, that's a problem that they... So this piece about getting wedded to the problem, observing around you, are super important pieces. But these are hard to learn. So like Harish Hande or like the M-Pesa guys, our formal systems actually teach you engineering or solutions first, and listening to people later. Or
If ever.
Yeah. Or
You have to teach yourself, right?
life teaches you
Life
listening
teaches
to
you,
people. So life teaches successful entrepreneurs that, hey, you can, if you listen to your potential customers, you might have a shot at solving a problem. Are there places where you've seen this happen more than others, where, hey, people are more keen to listen and to observe and then probably build or then probably experiment, versus others? And maybe it's different kinds of education systems or different kinds of universities where you may have observed that, hey, you see this happening a lot more. This innate principle of just observing, empathizing, and then experimenting.
Again, I'd like to say that, like in places like Cambridge or in the UK where my kids study, you have that and you don't. I mean, my kids are now doing the equivalent of 12 standard exams and 10 standard exams in the UK. And I'm quite shocked that the system there is almost exactly like it was when I was studying here in India. It's exam oriented, it's learning what's in the textbooks and repeating it in the exam. And whereas, when they were in primary school in the UK, there was much more creativity and exploration. They were involved. There was a curriculum. But for instance, when my daughter was in year 1, her teacher on Friday would get them together. They would sit around. The class size is a bit smaller, even in the state schools in the UK, about 30, but still a big class. They would sit around, and the teacher would say, like, next week, we're going to be learning addition, let's say, numbers. So now I want you, as a class, and you put them in groups, think about how we would learn this by play. And then the kids would come up with some ideas. They would put numbers on the ground in like a maze, and how you get from 1 to 2, and things like this. And then the next week, she would use their ideas as a way to teach them. And I thought, wow, this is mind-blowing, because it combines structure, curriculum, they're learning concepts that they need to learn, but not in this kind of rote way, and they themselves are involved in their own learning and creativity and so on. But gradually, as they went through the school system, it became more and more regimented, the way that I thought we had left it behind in the 80s when I was growing up. And when you come to university, it's even more so. It's even more, even today. I mean, yes, you might do like assignments and you might do presentations, you do a lot of that, but you also have exams and you're expected. Now, I'm in a business school, and many of our employers, we have MBAs and so on, many of our employers tell us that, yes, they expect our students to know what's in the textbooks. So that's a given. So you can't stop doing that. They need to know about finance, accounting, marketing, all that kind of stuff. But that's only the hygiene factor. They also want people who are on day one are entrepreneurial. And what do they mean? People who come into their organization, immediately get a sense of what this organization is about, know what the issues that need solving are, happy to work in teams who are very different from them, know how to work with diverse groups, proactive, can manage their time, all this kind of stuff. Take some sensible risk, deal with failure. And where is that in our curriculum? How do you teach that in a classroom? So over the years, we've had to give them live projects while they're doing classroom lectures and exams. And we have real clients, startups in Cambridge, global companies at different points in the year, where teams of students, 4 or 5, work on these problems. And that's how we're doing it, so learning by doing. So, I mean, what you just described is like even more interesting, because you're actually putting people in their communities, having them go out in their communities and find problems to solve. Whereas here the problems are coming from companies. But that's how we do it.
Yeah, fantastic. My last question, and then I want to open up. So this is like a nudge to start thinking or penning down your questions to Jaideep and for a discussion in the room. It's a small group. And would also want to include voices of people who have tried this, who have experiences with this, to add to this conversation. Yeah, Jaideep, my final question on frugal innovation that scales. UPI is an example, M-Pesa is an example. Are there principles that you feel are critical? And you talked about 6 principles in this book, written long time back, and I'll repeat them. But of those 6, or that you have evolved or your thinking has evolved, like what are the principles that are possibly useful for thinking of frugal innovation that can scale? The principles you talked about were as in seeking opportunity in adversity, keeping it simple, do more with less, include the margins, and follow your heart. Those were the 6 principles that you listed out in this book. From 2012 to now, has your thinking around these principles changed? And specifically when it comes to, because here you've documented all kinds of frugal innovations, many that don't scale. Given we live in India, we're talking about inclusive growth as a key goal for us. We need frugal innovations that do scale. Are there principles that are more useful than others?
Yeah. So given you mentioned DPI, and given that we are in Bangalore International Center, I should mention that I've interviewed Nandan on many occasions over the years, even before Aadhaar. So actually, between when he stepped down from Infosys and when he joined the government, he came to Cambridge on his book tour when he was talking about imagining India, and he gave a talk then. And so at that point, he was already talking about Aadhaar, and a few months later or weeks later, he was invited into government to do it. And since then, I have interviewed him on several occasions. And so in his mind, and in the mind of a lot of people in that ecosystem who've been involved not only with Aadhaar, but UPI, and now with AI solutions, and, there is a very intimate link between scaling and affordability or frugality. So you have to have this vision in a country like India of scaling your solution, right? We were talking about education, well, anything. It's got to scale because that's the right thing to do. It's the inclusive thing to do. But that's also the economically viable thing to do because your margins are so thin, the only way you'll make a profit is to scale. So you've got to have that vision and you've got to build that in. It's got to be a design principle when you're coming up with a solution. So the solution has to be affordable, often highly affordable, in order to scale. But if you scale, it'll also help with the affordability. So there's a very nice positive feedback loop. So I'd say that's a key thing, key principle. And then the question is, with that vision, how do you do it? Then the design thinking principles come in of really deeply understanding the problem, empathizing, and only then coming up with a solution given what the constraints are, what the resources are, and so on. So I'd say that's really the heart of it. And if I think about 3 things, it's that frugality, it's this very flexible mindset, not being married to the solution but to the problem and being willing to course correct, change, and so on, that flexible mindset. And then that inclusive vision, that you really want it to reach a large number of people, as far as possible. Yeah, so I'll boil it down to that.
Yeah, on that last note, right, and you have 2 of your principles, which is include the margins and follow your heart, that are intriguing. And generally not necessarily things that people who want to create large-scale impact or build large companies think about. Um, how did you first even come up with these principles? And, and yeah, how much of it have you seen it play out?
Yeah. So the principles we literally came up with inductively from the cases. Initially, we were just interviewing individuals, and like from Mansukh Bhai in Gujarat with the Mitti Cool fridge, to Harish Hande of Selco, to Dr. Mohan from Chennai, who's diabetes, telemedicine. So we just had lots of these people we were interviewing, the Embrace Baby Warmer. I could go on, right? And then we sort of inductively from that said, okay, what are some of the things that seem to be guiding people? And this include the margin came from that. So if you see someone like Mansukh Bhai or Dr. Mohan, he's thinking of people who we don't typically think of as a target market, right? Or as even as people we want to help with a solution. Or even Harish Hande. You know, solar you think middle class, affluent or corporates, not people who are buying kerosene for lighting. So we saw that as that was the inclusion bit, right? So a lot of these solutions were designed for people who are outside the formal economy. And the solution was to, in a way, to bring them in. And interestingly, the twist to that was they were not only, these models were not only treating those marginal people or marginalized people as customers or beneficiaries, but also as part of the solution, right? Co-creators. And where there was shared value, they were getting some of the value. So in Harish Hande's example, the local entrepreneurs he was developing had a stake in the game and would then have, be in the formal economy and have a business and so on. Dr. Mohan would train, again, very similar, would identify people from villages who'd go to Chennai for some training and then go back and be the local health volunteer. And that would help them with skills, give them employment and so on. So that's where that include the margin came from. It seemed to be a key part of both your vision as well as making it a reality. And then the passion bit, we were struck by how some of these people had stuck with that idea for years against all odds and all kinds of adversity, right? So Harish Hande, it took him 3 years to convince the bank to give loans to these entrepreneurs that he was going to guarantee. And he said that, for instance, farmers, when he was developing solutions for farmers, the banks were giving loans to farmers, but for agricultural solutions, not for renewable energy. So he had a lot of work to do, and it takes time, and you get a lot of no's, and doors slammed in your face. You have to be able to pick yourself up every day and go at it again. So those two came out from, again, all this came out from the stories, that people were telling us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, up for audience. Yeah.
I think that gentleman also, I think you raised your hand as a critic of Jugaad. So I'm curious now. I'm bracing myself here for some...
Hi, my name is Jaskaran. I interpreted your journey with 2 books as a 2-step process, Jugaad and then Frugal innovation. And I'm going to take one example and ask you, why do we Indians perhaps not succeed at frugal innovation in a big way? I'll give you an example. The UPI industry in India, the 3 biggest players in the UPI market, PhonePe, Google Pay, and maybe Amazon Pay, all 3 are subsidiaries of large American corporations. The Indian banks who have the framework, the UPI framework is known, it is running into billions of transactions every month, no doubt about it, but none of the banks are able to match up with these guys. Why so? We are in India. I mean, I have the same bank account linked to my Google Pay and to my too big to fail bank account. The bank account does not allow me to take a screenshot and send as a proof of payment. The Google Pay allows me to do that. So I'm just giving a simple example. So why have we not internalized that same frugal innovation mindset? Jugaad we can do, but why not the frugal one?
So could I ask you, maybe, just could you keep giving the microphone back? Because you're making a distinction between Jugaad and Frugal. Can you tell me why you're making that distinction? What do you mean by that?
So in my mind, and it may not match yours, Jugaad is where we are going to find loopholes around the corner and we are going to move ahead with it. And this is typically in a large red tape country like India. So you wanted transportation in Punjab, so the guys fit the pump set engine, and that's the origin of the Jugaad. Okay,
Yeah,
but it took somebody to have guts to create a company like AMW, which says I will get components from the best companies in the world and make the best truck. But the Jugaad is a way out. Frugal innovation is scalable and it is profitable.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that. So that's a nice distinction to make, and I think we were trying to get at that. And this has been a recurring question that I've received and I've also had in my mind. Now, let me just first say about the use of the word Jugaad versus frugal. That's also very interesting to me because, as I said earlier, when we used the word Jugaad, we got pushback in India, and then we decided to use the term Jugaad innovation to distinguish it, right? But then when we were writing for a Western audience, in English, not many people still have, even though it's in the Oxford English Dictionary, know what Jugaad is. So we use the word frugal. But I'm not so happy with the word frugal either, by the way, because it connotes sort of cost cutting. It doesn't have that kind of ingenuity bit. Even the chalu bit, certainly not the chalta hai, but even the chalu bit. So anyway, so that's my thought on that. But I take your point. The point about you come up with a quick fix, that's the Jugaad, we're very good at doing that. But then how do you scale it and how do you capture the value from it? And that's where we see, even in India, a lot of the big multinationals or sometimes Western entrepreneurs and so on. And this is where I think we need what you're doing, which is we need to find a way to really spread the tools and techniques and the mindset that Indians have sort of innately at some level, like the farmers and so on. Every Indian has that, but there are some things that they need to complement that, which can help them to scale their ideas and then learn how to capture the value from that as well. And I think we're starting to see that. That was my thesis of it, but I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'll attempt an answer from a different lens. I was early part of Flipkart, and the PhonePe folks are dear friends, and right, and they're as Indian as it gets, right? Yes, they're shareholders, and it's funny when Flipkart was starting to look for potential investors, that none of the Indian conglomerates could even imagine a third of both what Amazon and Walmart put on table, right? So I feel like the issue lies possibly elsewhere, because Flipkart was an India-created Indian entity with Indians building it from scratch, like creating cash on delivery, which worked in India, doing things that were very, very India-specific, and being able to create it, like take it up to scale. Our appetite for investing and thinking about, hey, how ambitious. So I'll use that to try and attempt an answer, and it's only a hypothesis. I see this with young kids that we work with quite a bit as well, which is we're able to solve small problems, but it's very hard for us to visualize that if wildly successful, what could this be like, right? So visualizing a very ambitious future remains a large challenge. We also work with small business entrepreneurs, and like asking them कि आपका goal क्या है? Like, it's like goal क्या होता है? Right? मतलब, why would you have a goal? Right? That this idea that hey, next year you could be at a place which might be different or better. And once you start talking about family, what you want for your kids, you will hear a lot of goals. You will hear a lot of personal goals. But that goal in the flavor of what could this product become, what could my business become, and what could hence like ambitious aspirations be, that I feel like compared to what I've seen in the US a lot, that hey, the US is a place where there are big visions, often hollow, but then those big visions actually do inspire a whole bunch of people to follow, right? And attract a lot of people and then make some of that happen. I feel, and I'm a middle class Indian, or was a middle class Indian, and have some of those values of not possibly dreaming as big or not sharing ambitious dreams and for the fear of being judged. And I think some of those cultural values might be holding us back.
Hi, I'm Archana. I write about startups for a living. So my question is a continuation actually of what you just said, Mekin. We are good at innovation, obviously, in terms of the environment that we live in, and also of Jugaad in the sense that was mentioned earlier, that you're cutting corners because the system does not allow you to get ahead, so you cut corners. So there are two things that are happening. Indians are good both at Jugaad and at innovation, as we have demonstrated, taking the world of startups in itself. But I feel the big challenge, and I think that also ties up with what you were saying. Like I said, I write about startups, and one of the things that we come up against regularly is a lack of governance, lack of understanding of governance, and of adhering to a rule-based system, right? Will that hold us back? What's the worth of innovation if you can't play according to a rule-based system which can take innovation to scale? To take something to scale, you need to have a system, a structure. And until now, Jugaad has served us well. We are innately innovative as as an ethnic group, as a group that sort of has to innovate just to get by in this country of ours. But without a rule-based system, how far will this take us? Isn't that an issue? And how does that sit along with Jugaad, along with frugal innovation? We can say all these things, but as someone who writes about these things on a day-to-day basis, I feel the big thing holding us back is that. And Mekin, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so happy to, because while I've been researching and writing about Jugaad and frugal innovation in the private sector, and then talking about those two books, I would get two types of questions. One was, Jugaad versus frugal, scaling versus startup. And the other question would be very similar to yours, which is, what is the role of government in all this? And what does this mean for governments?
No, her question's governance.
I have not made myself clear. I meant governance as in corporate governance.
Ah, okay, I see.
How
I
are
see.
we self-regulating?
I see.
Innovating, yes.
Ah, okay.
But this is not
Right.
government.
Ah, okay. Ah, okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Governance
Okay.
within companies,
Ah,
within startups.
okay. Yeah.
How does that sit with innovation and Jugaad, which we're
Yeah.
very good at, as we've demonstrated. But our entrepreneurs and our innovate, I'm not tarring everybody with the same brush, have also demonstrated that they're not very good with adhering to a rule-based
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a fair point. And, again, I think it helps to make a distinction between a part of innovation which, in fact, operates outside of any systems because it's different, right? And that's the early phase, I was saying, fuzzy front end, and that's where Jugaad lends itself very well. But then when you come up with a rudimentary solution, in order to scale, you need what I was calling process and structure. I would add governance comes under that. So a lot of startups, not just in India, around the world, this is a very common problem, that what got you to a certain stage might actually not help you get to the next stage, and often it's the founder and the founder's mentality or the founding team's mentality. And, one of the things that it doesn't help with the scaling is that they don't put into place then processes and systems and governance, and they don't professionalize. So I think that's a universal problem. It's not just an Indian problem. And that's almost a problem of human psychology, because the person who started it up is a Jugaadu by definition. And for them to also have this structured process thinking is difficult. So sometimes they have to hand over to professionals, and that's hard for them to do. You see this in family businesses, very classically. So that's a universal problem. It's absolutely true. You got to do it. But perhaps in other places there are role models. But I actually do think that even for internal governance, you need to have external structures and rules. And that's why I alluded to government. So we have to talk about that as well, because that sets the overall framework within which companies then are forced to do certain things or not. So I think there is an element of external governance that matters.
Okay, a lot of hands up. I'll maybe share just one quick again, maybe a different lens, and Archana, I'd love to talk about this. I feel some of this is just cultural. What you are seeing being represented in the startup ecosystem is not very different from what you see on a traffic signal in India, right? You might just, and I think to wish that the startup ecosystem would behave differently, just like we wish that, hey, doctors need to be more ethical, or IS officers need to be more responsible, I feel is foolhardy because they are all representative of the society that we live in, right? So, and I think there is enough to be said, and you just touched upon government and culture of like, hey, if by breaking the norm or breaking the rule, you seem to be getting ahead in the short term, and that's the culture that every father is teaching their kid, right? That, hey, do not follow the line. There is a way around. I feel like culturally, we aren't becoming a society that will have a chance at scaling things. So this piece about, hey, the chance at scaling things, you need people who are able to think about systems, design, and make those happen. Sorry, they were like,
Yeah.
thank you.
Hi, Sajju Jain. I want to take off the first question that we were asked. And my question is going to be about capital. I'll set quick context. You mentioned Embrace. I used to be the COO and CFO for Embrace. Recently, for the last 18 months, I'm trying to create a voice-enabled AI device that can be given to children all across India that can be their perpetual 24/7 tutor, right? And constantly, whether it was Embrace, whether it is this, I can list several other ideas, capital seems to be the big roadblock to scaling, right? When we talk about scaling, and you mentioned about PhonePe as well, like we were not, the foreign investors were able to put a sum that even the Indian conglomerates couldn't even think about. Now, when we talk about frugal innovation, have you found in the West any, because there I'm assuming the capital is not a constraint. Are there frugal innovations that have been able to breach the capital barrier? Because even for Aadhaar, we finally needed the government to step in and fund all that. So are there examples, are there principles, are there theories of successes in the West that have adopted frugal innovation and been able to scale it with capital access or with reduced capital access? Have they been frugal in their capital?
Absolutely, great. So again, great question. And I think the capital access thing is a double-edged sword where frugal innovation is concerned because, yes, you do need capital, but maybe not too much because then you get lazy. And, again, I think of Harish Hande, and he says that, don't take too much money or don't start with too much money because then that makes you lazy. And if you start with less money, you have to think hard. And it also reminds me of a famous Cambridge physicist, Rutherford, who said when an American was visiting the Cavendish labs, he said, how do you guys do this? How do you discover the electron in this little building? And he said, because we don't have resources, we have to think. So now you ask a question about other ways in the West, and yes, Cavendish is an example. But I've also been able to compare the Silicon Valley model with, say, the UK's Silicon Fen, as we call it in Cambridge model, with the Indian model. And I think it's a continuum. In India, it's very frugal. It's like highly affordable. And there can be false economies. That is, you try to save money and then that gets in the way of scaling. If you have absolutely no capital or very little, that'll get in the way of your scaling, no matter how ingenious your solution is. In the US, I think you have the opposite problem. There's just too much money. It's flush with money. And so there are lots of stupid ideas that are failing. But venture capital is happy to take some risk because they'll get one big blockbuster. And then they have enough capital to really scale it. And to the point where it becomes a monopoly, which has other problems. In the UK and in places like Cambridge, you have an interesting middle ground where the business model, they don't have that much capital. It's much harder to get capital than in the US, but they have enough. And so you see these models. I don't know if you've heard of ARM, A-R-M. So ARM has the largest footprint of any chip maker, but they don't make any chips. They just design the chips, and they're in all the devices that you can think of. So they don't make any chips. They don't have factories. They're not like Intel. They don't have that footprint. They have IP. And they give it away pretty cheap. It's a very frugal model. They give it away very cheap. They sell their IP very, but that gives them immense scale, and they make their profits in that way. Their margins are thin, but their volumes are huge. The Raspberry Pi is another example of that, you know. And these are bootstrapped. Because they were, again, this idea of this highly frugal, very affordable. The ARM chip was meant for very sort of low energy processors. And of course, timing is also important. It helped that mobile phones were taking off, and this was perfectly suited for them, right? Same thing as Raspberry Pi sort of tapped into the whole maker movement. So not just, initially they were meant for school kids, but now it's like adults, and there's a whole maker movement. So I think there is a happy middle ground, where perhaps in the early stages you shouldn't be too flush with money, because that forces you to really think of what's the problem you're trying to solve and doing that with in the most affordable way. And then when you scale, you get good, you know, decent doses, injections of capital to scale, but not outsized.
Yeah, again, slightly different lens on thinking about this for inclusive solutions or impact solutions. And there's been talk about impact investing, etc., which unfortunately continues to have the same fund length, for example, right? That a fund is typically 8 to 10 years, and impact investment funds are exactly the same. There isn't any more patience than those 8 to 10 years for those funds either. Their measurements remain primarily financial. So the ones that I have seen have been part philanthropic or blended capital of, like, hey, friends and family plus philanthropy, helping you get off the ground. That said, I feel for an entrepreneur, requisite amount of fundraising is a must do. There is, like we were just talking, that there are enough Cambridge researchers who feel like, hey, they've found sliced bread and now the world should be at their door. Doesn't work that way. You have to go knocking down doors. I spent a large part of last year trying to fundraise for the nonprofit that I run, and was a whole bunch of failures. And only this year now, like, some things have started to change. But it requires time, effort, and just doing it. And is as important a skill as the innovation itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, hi, I'd like to know what are the legal and ethical implications of frugal innovation, particularly in terms of labor practices, maybe environmental health, and the potential for exploitation, in terms of low-cost solutions, especially in an emerging market like India.
Yeah, so this is the dark side of frugal innovation, or Jugaad, right? So there is a dark side, and this is why I don't like the word frugal so much, because it implies cost cutting. And the first thing you do when you do cost cutting is that you end up taking the money out of the pay package of your employees. And so I think that's the dark side, you know. Take Amazon. I mean, immensely successful, very focused on the customer and giving value to the customer, but often at the expense of their employees, the people in their fulfillment centers, and there are cases now against them around the world. So there is a dark side, there's no denying it. But equally, in a country like India, you know, you're not going to have a solution for all the problems we face if it's not highly affordable. And so you have to find that sweet spot where you can come up with a solution that's highly affordable, but not at the cost of the people who are involved in making and delivering that solution. And that's all about ethics, it's all about governance, it's all about the overall governance, the rules of the system, and so on. And that's where you need civil society, you need the courts, you know, all those kinds of things. Yeah.
Hello.
So it's by no means a panacea. I don't want you to leave with that thought.
Hi, my name is Jamuna, and I worked in the fintech space and the impact investment space. My question to you, and also with UPI. UPI was a solution at scale, but it was definitely not frugal. We were armies of people who were working. The government was doing all the funding. And even now, the government basically is subsidizing it. The banks don't charge, all these people don't charge. So there are issues in that sense. Or for that matter, M-Pesa. There's Vodafone who was behind them. I mean, looking at all these innovations, Reliance Jio, which really changed the world for us. We had Reliance behind them. Flipkart, it had, I mean, they started off small, but finally there was lots of money. So I'm not very clear on when you say frugal innovations, I'm not seeing in India the scale really, other than in financial services, the whole microfinance. But even now, with all this impact investment and all that, really there aren't those solutions which are scaling. So I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think, we were saying earlier that Jugaad alone is not going to get you to scale, or Frugal alone is not going to get you to scale. Jugaad and Frugal may be particularly good in the fuzzy front end, getting to a minimum viable product, testing it, getting to a solution. The scaling process, as we were just discussing, will require some capital or some other complementary resources, which large companies typically or the government have in spades. So again, it's not a miracle maker. There are limits, and that's why if you're an entrepreneur or if you're a large company, you need to understand these tools and where they're relevant and how far they'll take you and when you need to do the other. So you still need structure, processes, capital, other complementary resources like brand or distribution. You need all those things. But even there, maybe you could do things in a frugal way, an affordable way, or in a quicker way. So it's just another tool, and it has limitations. It's not a miracle maker. But equally, without it, you might not even get to that initial solution, let alone to the scale. Now, actually, on UPI, it's quite interesting because in some ways, like if you think about Aadhaar, relatively speaking, other countries have tried to do digital ID. Aadhaar is a much more affordable solution. It was like roughly $1 per person, which is partly because it's scaled. But because they had that vision of scale, they were able to drive the price down. But yes, you had to have a market maker like the government. The government had to say that it was willing to put public money behind that, which would then create that market for, let's say, biometric enrollment equipment, which then the price plummeted in that year when the government announced its objective was to enroll 500 million people. So it does help to have resources and scale. There's no doubt about it. Or at least those tools that will get you to scale.
Yeah, I'll maybe last about 8-10 years I've been working mostly in the impact space. So my experience of both seeing things scale, I've found things that use either of these three levers. First is just government. Like government is a massive amplifier. In India today continues to be a provider of service for many, many services. So whether it's 108, the ambulance, whether it's ASHA workers, where the model was found in one district in Gadchiroli and then scaled across the country, etc. I think government as a scale agent has happened and has worked across multiple areas. Tech is a big scale enabler. I think WhatsApp, as in we've talked about UPI. There are multiple other places where tech has enabled. COVID was a good example to visualize a lot of that happening, to be able to scale things that otherwise would be very, very hard to scale. I think a third, and you touched upon it, which is community. Right, that there are communities that are able to adopt things and make them the norm and almost make it cultural. And self-help groups are a great example of it. I feel like very few innovators think about communities as possible scale agents. It's harder, but once there, then they are very, very resilient and they last probably much longer than government and tech as scale drivers.
Just one question from me, Vikram here. What is the potential you see of frugality to infect groups of people to think a certain way? And I'll give a very specific example. In Bangalore, we have a lot of home bakers now, for example. And, and they choose their level of scale. So it seems to me like we're keeping the conversation bounded by a scale of a certain notion in our heads. But what about creating this movement around an idea that might scale, and then everybody kind of knows how to make it? Like a Maggie model.
I mean, I'm interpreting two things in your question. So one is that, and this you said this earlier, you said that one of the things holding many Indians back may be that we don't have that vision of scaling and what can be done, which the Americans have in spades. And sometimes I wonder if it's not a bad thing that they don't have those ambitions, because a lot of entrepreneurs don't want to do it to be the next Elon Musk or Bill Gates or whatever. They want to do it to get their kids through school and put food on the table. It's a lifestyle choice. Many entrepreneurs are that way around the world, but in India you might see a lot. And so actually maybe a bad thing to try and get them to scale. Some, on the other hand, you may want to encourage them to scale. So that was one thing I interpreted. The other thing I interpreted from your question was an idea that I think is very powerful and could be applied more widely, which is this idea of a social franchise. So for instance, we start the Jugaad book with the story of Mansukh Bhai, who in his village in Gujarat came up with the Mitti Cool Fridge, which is a brilliant product. I mean, and it's actually available. It's a clay fridge, for those who don't know. It's like a matka principle applied to a fridge. So the matka is on the top, and you can drink the water, and below that is a box where you can put fruit and veg, and the water evaporates to the walls. It drops the temperature by about 8 degrees Celsius. Matka principle can keep your fruit and veg fresh. And the design is beautiful. He's gone on to do all kinds of things. You can see him, and he sells them even on the internet. And I have 2 of them in my office in Cambridge. So I ordered them, and they came, and so on. Now I've often thought, like, okay, how do you scale this? Either Mansukh Bhai gets to get venture capital and he becomes this figure who goes around, and then other Mansukh Bhais, and he sets up these factories, right? And he may not want to do it. He probably doesn't want to do it. Or it's a social franchise. He has a formula, a bit like McDonald's, and then local Mansukh Bhais buy that formula, pay a license fee, and set up their factory in their village. And I think, the Padman could do the same thing. And he did, in fact. So I think that's an idea that we haven't exploited. And in a country like India, that could be dynamite. I mean, huh?
It's called Lijjat Papad.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you've seen it, yeah. Okay. So that role models. And then the question is, we need more of those. Yeah. So, okay, thanks for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, my name is Prakash, and I've worked in innovation in a multinational company, done a bit of Jugaad myself. I have a slightly different take on Jugaad, and it doesn't necessarily mean it has a dark side or it's cutting corners. Or it's actually finding solutions at a cost that the microeconomic environment can bear. Yeah, there will be people who will do things like flouting rules and whatever, but that's not a monopoly of Jugaad. I mean, think pharma. I mean, what are we talking about? And I have a different take on frugality as well. I mean, yeah, if you go by the definition of the dictionary, frugality, you talk, it's doing things cheaply. Actually, in the current global context, I think frugality should be manufacturing things with the minimum use of resources. It doesn't matter at what cost or where you pitch it. And the third point is, it was said that cost cutting doesn't involve high tech. Actually, some cost cutting involves the latest technology. I've done it myself. I mean, if you're talking about reducing packaging cost, you can't do it by just using cardboard in place of the current packaging. You got to look at what barrier properties of new materials that are there. And then you come up with a solution that's cheaper and more effective.
No, thank you so much. I think all 3 of those are like such wholesome points. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. Those are brilliant points, excellent points. Completely agree.
Hi, my name is Prashant Venkatramana. I run a company called S-Smart. We have been in the business of bringing technology innovations to rural areas in a market setting. So we work with retail shops for the past 12 years. Actually, I met my co-founder at Cambridge, and she was very inspired from your book later in the following year, and also with C.K. Pralad's book. So we've seen that, I rose my hand when you said who has a problem with Jugaad. I have not a problem, but I'd like to just challenge or push it a little bit. I think it focuses a little bit too much on the idea and less on the execution. That's one of the problems that I have. The second is, I think when it comes to adopting technology in rural areas, especially many of the products that you spoke about, specifically even the Mitti Cool, the Embrace Warmer, and all of those, which we've tried selling, some of those to success and some with little success. I think the problem is that it really discounts some of the realities of what the customers really want in rural areas, especially around reliability, after-sales support, and also to a great extent, what is becoming more a phenomenon in India, that thing of aspiration. So nobody wants to pay money and buy a clay fridge and keep it in their house is the reality that we see on the ground when we sail through fridge, as much as people do. And even when they do it, it involves a great amount of de-risking, like Selco's model of paying 10 rupees a day. They know that they can go and give it back when they're only paying 10 rupees a day and not that upfront 300 or 2,000 rupees that it actually costs. So some of these things, I think, maybe need some follow-up in terms of the execution and things like that. But it's made some of these problems come to light and globally. So thank you very much for putting the spot on some of this. That's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for adding to the conversation. Brilliant additions.
I just want to pick up on, I completely agree, excellent points and so on. I just wanted to pick up on your point about the aspiration bit, because I think that's also missed out quite often. People focus so much on the affordability and not the aspiration. And particularly maybe people in rural areas, people on lower incomes, are aspirational. So you've got to make it affordable, but then you've also got to ensure that it's something that they desire. And how do you do that? It's through the execution, it's through design, it's through the aesthetics, it's through the after-sales service, all these kinds of things. So that is the real challenge. Oh, and I know you had mentioned sustainability. Yeah, so Nano is an example.
Tata Nano is a...
Yeah.
The price point actually setting the aspiration too low.
Yeah.
So, hi. So, frugal innovation is very good and Jugaad and
You
all
should
that.
tell people who you are. They know.
I'm Ashok Mishra. I was his teacher in IIT Delhi.
Not just... He was not just the director, he was not just the teacher, he was the director of IIT
I was
Delhi.
the director of IIT. I thought this was a more personal
True,
connect with you. And I was the director of IIT Bombay. So, one of the things that we do is in IITs and institutions like that, we open departments and centers for rural technology. And here there is urban people trying to find solutions for the rural people. So we have to have innovators in the rural areas. We have to teach them as to how innovations can be developed for their needs. We don't understand their needs. Now, as an example, there are some people who have done that. So Harish Hande being one, but again, it's a very technical thing that he's doing. There's a guy from Kanpur. He's started a company called Pool.com. I don't know if you have heard of it. You know what Pool.com does? Many of you may not know. He collects flowers, his group, flowers from all the temples. All the flowers collects all those flowers, converts them into a cardboard-like product which is used for packaging. He makes Ganeshas and all that. Put it in water, it goes away. So these kind of things are there. So this sort of thing should be there. Frugal innovation, also very country specific. It's only in our country that we have overhead tanks and we have to have a pump which will fill it up. So you have to have something which will say that aapki tanki bhar gayi hai, please turn off this thing. These kind of innovations are also country specific. The kind of overhead tanks that we make, no other country makes because we need it. But then I think we should go more in the rural because 60% people, we don't know what their problems are, what they want, what they need. Another example, a student from IIT Delhi, he collects saris, polyester saris. A lot of urban people don't wear polyester saris anymore, but rural people do. So he collects those saris, converts them into products which are sellable. He has made from different colors of the saris an equivalent of Rembrandt paintings. I'll send it to you. It's amazing. And he has taught these women to do this. So this is the kind of thing which is needed in our country.
Absolutely agree. And in fact, this is what you're doing, right? The examples you gave.
Yeah, I think the democratizing problem solving, right? And I feel when we work with young kids, it's mostly about helping them and more importantly, the adults around them believe that these kids can actually solve problems. Like yesterday, I was with about 700 kids, all from government schools in Karnataka, and we just asked them to, in a 20-minute session, redesign a school bag. The kind of ideas that these kids came up with because they live with that school bag every day was phenomenal. Like it included like auto adjusting based on the timetable. That, hey, books that I don't need, tell me that I need to take these out because my bag is heavy. It came from the problem of the bag is heavy. I don't want to carry this heavy bag. But these kids, so like I feel it's mostly the adults who've been schooled too much, who've been conditioned too much by the world to believe that this is the only way we can live, who need to probably give way and trust kids a little more to, because they have fresh eyes and are able to see things in very, very new way. And similarly, I think like it's only when you experience or when you see something very close can you empathize and then solve the problem. So democratizing and then providing a little bit of both confidence and capital. Like of my 7 years, like I think my proudest achievement is 10 lakh kids getting 2,000 rupees each, right, to go solve a problem, right? And I think being able to do that at scale and making that happen for a large number of kids, I feel can help in both just building that mindset that, oh, I can, right, is...
An example was this professor from IIT Bombay, worked with the design center, worked with bamboo, and he actually went and lived for 2 years in the Northeast and developed tools so that these guys could make the bamboo products twice as fast. But then, you know, urban people have to go and live.
Have to go, absolutely. There's no shortcut there, yeah.
Okay, we have a...
It's a sentimental sort of question, but Jugaad is an Indian concept, right? And do you think that, does Jugaad end where scaling begins? Because a mom, like, you know, a beautician who just starts off on her own will now have to become a part of Urban Clap, and she has to abide by those rules and therefore can't use her own sort of creativity and, you know, how she would like to run her own thing. And so she just has to become a part of the system to scale and just lose her own identity.
And this is a bit like the question that you had asked earlier.
Maybe
about
I'll given Archana as a friend and I'm an urban company investor, I'll take the question. That I feel like I feel like actually Madhav Chavan wrote beautifully about this, which is instead of the American model of McDonald's, if you think about a Chinese restaurant, right? They're not chains, or some of them are, but like, and they're yet so similar. Like that, like so many Chinese restaurants doing very, very similar stuff, but not necessarily belonging to any one entity, and yet, and hence can add their own creativity. I'm going to hazard this guess and almost a request for people to build on this case. My little research showed up that Hot Chips, right, is not a franchise. It is a social franchise, as he called it, right? So the brand colors, the font, the recipes are all available for people to take it up and set up a Hot Chips near you, right? And again, I don't think like this idea or this concept exists globally. This is very Indian, that the community is willing to share what might feel proprietary and just enable Hot Chips to happen with consistency across at least large parts of South India. It's not something that a large number of capitalists can even imagine. So Ganesha, Hot Chips, I think these are darshanis in general, right? Are great examples of like, hey, very high consistency, very, very similar practices, and yet like they aren't necessarily owned by one entity, or they aren't following a strict process. So if one of the darshanis, or Archana, if your darshani chooses to...
But you know, your comment has triggered a thought in my mind. A lot of us seem to be approaching the problem from the direction of the startup trying to scale. But only, I think, perhaps the gentleman behind you gave the context, gave us a view from the direction, the other direction, which is the corporate, the multinational, which has all the governance and the processes and the structures and the money, and they want to know how to do Jugaad and frugal innovation. A lot of the people I talk to on a daily basis are people in large companies that are saying, how do we get out of the straitjacket we've put ourselves into of all these structures? And so we've been talking to people in large companies and asking them, how do they try and do Jugaad in the gaps between all these structures and the governance? And just as one example, we talked recently to someone at P&G, and she was saying, she uses, and you may have heard this famous, 3M rule of 30% of your time on new ideas, or Google 70-20-10. She says she just uses that basic principle to give her people, 70% of your time is within the corporate structures, all the governance kicks in, all that, and that's business as usual. But 20% of your time, you can come up with something that's new, but for the company, and 10% could be your idea. And I think that's a very nice, simple principle, which corporates can use to give their people some permission to do the experimentation and fail fast, fail cheap. So your thing about 2,000 rupees to kids, Adobe does this as well. They give their people like these 10, small amounts, and credit card, do whatever you want, knock yourself out, and some of those ideas might work.
Okay. On that note of go knock yourself out, try, experiment, fail fast, and Vikram signaling that we have to go out and get some whiskey. So I'll call this to a close. Thank you so much. I feel like I have learned, as in both from Jaideep and from some of the amazing experiences in the audience. So feel fortunate to have been part of this. Thank you so much for holding space and contributing.
Yeah.